For much of his public life, Simon Cowell was known as the man who could end a performance with a glance. His reputation was built on precision, blunt honesty, and an almost unshakable control over emotion. Audiences expected him to be the final authority in a room, the one who separated potential from illusion without hesitation. Yet life has a way of rewriting even the most carefully constructed identities. Beneath the fame, the contracts, and the global recognition, there was a man who had long convinced himself that fatherhood simply wasn't part of his story. He often spoke as if his life was already complete in its own way, structured around work, success, and independence. That certainty began to shift quietly, not through spectacle, but through something deeply personal and unexpected. It wasn't an announcement or a public decision, but a gradual emotional unraveling that began long before the world noticed anything had changed. The idea of becoming a father, once dismissed with casual certainty, started to take on a different weight. It was unfamiliar territory, not because he lacked understanding of responsibility, but because it demanded a kind of emotional exposure he had never fully embraced. When life eventually pushed him into that role, it didn't arrive gently or on his terms. It arrived in a way that dismantled assumptions and replaced them with something far more complex. The transition wasn't about abandoning who he was, but about discovering parts of himself that had never been tested. The man who once judged others for a living was now stepping into a role where judgment had no place, only understanding, patience, and emotional presence. It marked the beginning of a transformation that could not be measured in career milestones or public approval. Instead, it unfolded in quieter ways, reshaping how he viewed connection, responsibility, and love itself. Fatherhood was no longer an abstract idea. It was becoming the defining force that would challenge everything he thought he knew about control and certainty. The Valentine's Day that changed everything, February 14, 2014, was meant to be just another date on the calendar, a day associated with sentimentality in a world Simon Cowell had never fully indulged in. Yet that particular Valentine's Day became something far more permanent than flowers or celebration. It marked the arrival of his son, Eric, and with that moment, the entire emotional landscape of his life began to shift in ways he could not have anticipated. For someone who had long dismissed the idea of fatherhood, the experience did not begin with expectation but with shock, followed quickly by something much deeper. When he first saw the scan, there was a pause in him that no professional achievement had ever created. It wasn't analytical or calculated, it was instinctive. He later admitted that something inside him changed instantly, a recognition that could not be rationalized or controlled. The emotional certainty he thought he had long abandoned returned in a form he did not recognize at first. The arrival of Eric brought with it a new emotional language. It was no longer about audiences or reactions or performance metrics. It was about presence, about connection that existed outside of applause or criticism. For the first time in years, Simon found himself thinking in terms of another person's future rather than his own trajectory. That shift, subtle at first, began to influence everything around him. What made the moment even more profound was its contrast to his previous beliefs. He had often assumed that certain emotional experiences had already passed him by. Yet here was something entirely new, something that did not care about timing or readiness. It simply arrived and demanded to be acknowledged. In that instant, a man known for control was introduced to something far more powerful, attachment that could not be negotiated. It was not just the birth of a child, but the beginning of a transformation that would redefine how he understood love, responsibility, and permanence. A name carrying memory and meaning. Naming his son Eric was not a casual decision. It carried emotional weight that extended beyond preference or tradition. The name was a direct connection to Simon Cowell's father, a figure who had played a significant role in shaping his values, discipline, and outlook on life. In choosing that name, he was not only welcoming a child into the world, but also preserving a lineage of memory and identity. That connection added a layer of emotional complexity to an already life-altering experience. Fatherhood was not just about stepping into a new role. It was also about revisiting parts of his past that still held influence over him. The name became a bridge between generations, linking what had shaped him to what he was now responsible for shaping in return. As Eric grew, Simon began to reflect more deeply on what legacy truly meant. It was no longer something tied to career or public recognition. It was something intimate, something that lived within relationships and daily presence. The idea of passing something forward took on a different meaning when it was no longer theoretical. At the same time, he became increasingly aware of the responsibility that came with it. He did not want his son to be defined by privilege or expectation. Instead, he wanted him to develop his own sense of identity, independent of fame or assumption. That intention began to influence the way he approached parenting, even in the earliest stages. What made this period especially significant was the emotional duality it created. On one hand, there was pride and connection to family history. On the other, there was the realization that preserving a legacy also meant letting go of control over how that legacy would evolve. In naming his son Eric, Simon was not simply honoring the past. He was stepping into a future that would constantly challenge his understanding of what it means to guide without defining. Early signs of a different path. As Eric grew through his earliest years, subtle observations began to emerge that quietly unsettled Simon Cowell's assumptions about development and expectation. At first, these were not alarming signs, but small moments that stood out in contrast to what others might consider typical milestones. Silence lasted longer than anticipated, reactions to sound seemed more intense, social engagement followed patterns that didn't always align with those of other children his age. These observations did not immediately lead to conclusions. Instead, they created a sense of quiet uncertainty that lingered in the background of daily life. Simon, known for his instinctive ability to read patterns in performance and behavior, found himself applying that same observational focus to his son. But this time, there were no scores, no evaluations, only questions without immediate answers. What made the experience more complex was the emotional resistance that came with it. It is never easy for a parent to separate concern from fear, or observation from interpretation. Simon found himself navigating that space carefully, trying not to impose meaning too quickly while also refusing to ignore what he was witnessing. Despite these concerns, what stood out just as strongly was Eric's depth of awareness. He was observant, intelligent in his own way, and capable of connection that did not always follow conventional expression. This duality created a space where uncertainty and admiration coexisted. Rather than rushing toward labels or conclusions, Simon began to pay closer attention. He noticed patterns not as problems to be solved, but as signals to be understood. That shift in perspective marked an important turning point in how he approached parenting. What was unfolding was not a deviation from expectation, but the beginning of a different kind of developmental path, one that required patience, observation, and a willingness to let go of predefined ideas about progress. For someone who had built a career on judgment, this was a profoundly different kind of learning, searching for understanding in silence. As questions began to grow, Simon Cowell found himself engaging in a form of research he had never experienced before. It was not professional, nor was it public. It was deeply personal, driven by a need to understand rather than evaluate. Late nights were no longer spent reviewing projects or business decisions, but reading, observing, and trying to make sense of developmental differences that did not come with simple explanations. This period was marked by silence in a different sense, not the absence of sound, but the presence of thought that could not easily be shared. Parenting, in this phase, became an internal process as much as an external one. Conversations with specialists, careful observations at home, and moments of reflection, all blended into a continuous effort to understand Eric's unique way of engaging with the world. What made this journey particularly complex was the absence of immediate clarity. There were no definitive answers in the early stages, only possibilities and evolving interpretations. That uncertainty required a level of emotional endurance that was unfamiliar, even for someone used to high-pressure environments. At the same time, Simon began to notice something important. Eric was not defined by what he did not do in expected ways, but by what he did in his own distinct manner. His attention, his focus, and his perception of detail revealed a kind of intelligence that did not always align with conventional measures. This realization slowly began to reshape Simon's understanding of development itself. Instead of viewing milestones as fixed markers, he started to see them as varied expressions of growth. That shift was not immediate, but it was significant. In this quiet search for understanding, a different form of parenting began to take shape, one that relied less on certainty and more on presence, observation, and acceptance of complexity without immediate resolution, redefining what growth truly means. As time passed, Simon Cowell found himself re-evaluating the very idea of what it means for a child to grow. The conventional framework of milestones, first words, social benchmarks, predictable timelines, began to feel less like universal truths and more like general guidelines that did not capture the full spectrum of human development. In Eric's case, growth was present, but it expressed itself differently. It was visible in attention to detail, in patterns of focus, and in the quiet ways he interacted with his environment. These expressions did not always align with external expectations, but they carried their own form of meaning and progress. This realization required a fundamental shift in perspective. Instead of measuring development against external standards, Simon began to observe it within context. He started to recognize that progress could exist in forms that were not immediately obvious to others, and that comparison was often an incomplete way of understanding individuality. The emotional impact of this shift was significant. It meant letting go of assumptions that had once felt automatic. It also meant accepting that parenting was not about directing a child toward a predefined outcome, but about supporting them as they discovered their own path. In this new understanding, small moments gained greater importance. A shared glance, a response to comfort, or a moment of calm engagement became meaningful indicators of connection. These were not dramatic achievements, but they carried emotional weight that traditional milestones often overlook. Through this process, Simon began to see that growth is not a single trajectory but a collection of experiences that vary widely from person to person. Eric was not behind or ahead, he was simply moving in his own direction. This reframing did not eliminate uncertainty, but it replaced it with something more sustainable, acceptance grounded in observation rather than expectation. The public and the private divide. While much of Simon Cowell's transformation was unfolding privately, the public continued to view him through the lens of his established identity. To the outside world, he remained the sharp, composed judge known for his decisive critiques and unwavering standards. That public image had been built over decades, and it did not easily accommodate nuance or vulnerability. Yet behind closed doors, a very different reality was taking shape. Fatherhood had introduced layers of emotional responsibility that were not visible on screen. The contrast between public perception and private experience became increasingly pronounced as Eric grew. This divide created a unique tension. On one side, there was expectation, the continuation of a familiar persona that audiences recognized and understood. On the other, there was a deeply personal journey that required patience, adaptation, and emotional presence. These two worlds did not always align, and navigating between them required careful balance. Despite this, Simon did not attempt to radically alter his public identity. Instead, he allowed the changes in his personal life to exist alongside his professional role. Over time, subtle shifts began to appear in how people perceived him. Moments of softness, glimpses of emotion, and expressions of genuine affection toward his son began to surface in rare public appearances. However, these glimpses only revealed fragments of a much larger story. The majority of his transformation remained private, shaped not by performance but by daily experience. Parenting a child with unique needs required consistency, adaptability, and a level of emotional investment that extended far beyond public visibility. The contrast between these two worlds ultimately highlighted a deeper truth. Identity is not singular. It exists in layers, shaped by context, responsibility, and personal connection, building a world of protection and care. As Eric's needs became clearer, Simon Cowell began reshaping his environment to provide stability and comfort. This was not a dramatic overhaul, but a gradual process of adjustment aimed at reducing stress and creating predictability. The home became more structured, routines became more intentional, and daily life was carefully organized to support consistency. This shift was driven not by restriction, but by understanding. Sensory sensitivities, emotional responses, and the need for predictable environments required thoughtful planning. What might appear ordinary to others often carried different implications within Eric's experience. Simon's approach to parenting evolved significantly during this time. Spontaneity, once a natural part of life, became more measured. Decisions were made with consideration for how they would affect comfort and emotional regulation. This required patience and adaptability, as well as a willingness to prioritize long-term well-being over convenience. At the same time, he remained committed to ensuring that Eric's life was not defined by limitation. Protection did not mean isolation. Instead, it meant creating conditions where growth could occur safely and naturally. This balance between structure and freedom became a central theme in their daily life. It was not always perfect, and it required constant adjustment, but it reflected a deeper understanding of what meaningful support looks like. Through this process, Simon discovered that parenting is not about control, but about responsiveness. It is about recognizing needs as they emerge and adapting accordingly, even when that requires letting go of preconceived ideas. Whispers, speculation, and silence. As Eric grew older, public curiosity began to increase. Subtle observations from outside sources led to speculation, often uninformed and frequently intrusive. Social media and gossip outlets filled gaps in understanding with assumptions, creating narratives that did not reflect the reality of the situation. Throughout this period, Simon chose silence. This was not avoidance, but protection. He understood that public explanation often comes at the cost of privacy, especially when it involves a child. The decision to remain private was rooted in a desire to shield Eric from unnecessary scrutiny. However, silence did not stop speculation. Instead, it often amplified it. The absence of information created space for interpretation, and not all interpretations were accurate or kind. This placed additional emotional pressure on an already sensitive situation. Despite this, Simon remained focused on what mattered most: his son's well-being. External noise could not dictate internal reality. The daily experience of parenting continued regardless of public commentary. Over time, this approach revealed its own challenges. Silence provided protection, but it also limited understanding from those who genuinely wanted to know the truth. It became a delicate balance between privacy and visibility, between guarding a child's world and acknowledging public curiosity. Ultimately, the decision to remain quiet was reaffirmed repeatedly. The priority was not narrative control, but emotional safety. In a world where speculation often moves faster than understanding, that choice carried significant weight. A turning point away from familiar comfort. A family vacation, intended as a moment of relaxation, became an unexpected turning point in Simon Cowell's understanding of Eric's experiences. New environments, unfamiliar sounds, and changes in routine created challenges that were difficult to ignore. What might have seemed like ordinary travel experiences to others had a much stronger impact on Eric's sense of comfort and regulation. One evening, during a meal in a busy setting, sensory overload became overwhelming. The combination of noise, movement, and unpredictability created distress that could not be easily managed. It was a moment that brought clarity in a way that previous observations had only hinted at. For Simon, witnessing this experience firsthand was both difficult and revealing. It highlighted the importance of environment in shaping emotional well-being and underscored the need for greater understanding and adaptation. That moment did not lead to immediate answers, but it did lead to a shift in direction. It became clear that further exploration and professional guidance were necessary to better understand Eric's needs. This realization was not about limitation, but about clarity. It marked the beginning of a more structured approach to understanding development, support, and emotional regulation. The day understanding became defined. The eventual diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder came after a long period of observation, consultation, and reflection. It was not unexpected, but hearing it spoken aloud gave structure to experiences that had previously existed in uncertainty. In that moment, Simon Cowell did not experience shock in the dramatic sense. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement that understanding had finally taken a defined shape. Questions that had circulated for years were now framed within a clearer context. The information provided by specialists was not centered on limitation, but on possibility. It emphasized that development follows diverse patterns and that support can enable meaningful growth in many different ways. This perspective offered reassurance rather than restriction. For Simon, the most important realization was not the label itself, but what it represented. A framework for understanding rather than a boundary for expectation. It allowed him to approach parenting with greater clarity and purpose. That evening, reflection replaced uncertainty. The focus shifted from questioning what might be different to understanding how to support those differences effectively. It marked a significant emotional transition, grounded in acceptance and informed awareness, rebuilding life around understanding. Following greater clarity, daily life began to take on a more structured form. Routines were refined, environments were adjusted, and support systems were put in place to ensure consistency and comfort. This process was not about restriction, but about creating stability. Therapeutic guidance became part of the broader approach to development, offering tools and strategies for communication, emotional regulation, and interaction. These were integrated into everyday life in practical ways, shaping how time was spent and how challenges were approached. For Simon Cowell, this period required a redefinition of patience. Progress was no longer measured in traditional increments, but in moments of connection and understanding. Each small step carried significance, even if it did not align with external expectations. This restructuring also influenced emotional perspective. It required letting go of previous assumptions about what childhood should look like and embracing a more individualized understanding of development. Over time, the home environment became a place of stability and predictability, designed to support rather than challenge. This shift reflected a deeper commitment to meeting Eric's needs in a thoughtful and consistent way, speaking the truth and facing response. Eventually, the decision was made to speak publicly about Eric's diagnosis. This was not an easy choice, but it was driven by a need to address speculation and protect his son from misinterpretation. When the truth was shared, the response varied. Some reacted with understanding and support, while others continued to speculate or misunderstand. Despite this, the act of speaking openly marked an important moment of clarity. It was not an attempt to invite attention, but to establish truth in a space often filled with assumption. By acknowledging reality, Simon shifted the narrative away from speculation and toward understanding. The response from many parents and individuals who shared similar experiences created unexpected connection. It revealed that openness can foster empathy, even in difficult circumstances. Life after the labels were spoken. After the diagnosis had been acknowledged and spoken aloud, life did not suddenly simplify. Instead, it entered a quieter, more deliberate rhythm. There is a misconception that clarity brings resolution, that once something is defined, the emotional weight behind it becomes easier to carry. In reality, what followed was not closure, but a deeper form of engagement with everyday life. Simon Cowell found himself living in a space where understanding existed, but where adaptation remained ongoing, continuous, and deeply personal. Each day required attention to detail that previously might have gone unnoticed, not in a burdensome way, but in a way that demanded presence. The way environments felt, the timing of transitions, the predictability of routines, all of these elements became part of a carefully shaped world designed not around limitation, but but around comfort and comprehension. Nothing about this process was static. It evolved constantly, responding to growth, change, and emotional nuance. What became increasingly clear was that parenting in this form was not about reaching a final stage. There was no endpoint where everything would settle into permanence. Instead, it was an ongoing dialogue between understanding and experience. Some days brought progress in visible ways, while others required patience without immediate reward. Emotionally, this period also brought reflection. Simon began to recognize how deeply his own expectations had been shaped by the world he had worked in for so long, one where performance, measurement, and comparison were constant. Parenting in this context could not operate under those same principles. It required a different internal framework, one that prioritized presence over evaluation. In time, life after labels became less about defining identity and more about supporting it. The focus shifted from understanding what something meant to understanding how to live with it meaningfully. That shift, though subtle, marked a profound change in how each day was experienced and valued. The quiet strength of adaptation. As time moved forward, adaptation became less of a conscious effort and more of a lived reality. What once required deliberate adjustment gradually turned into instinctive understanding. The household environment, the pacing of routines, and the emotional awareness surrounding everyday interactions all began to settle into a rhythm that felt natural, even if it was built through careful intention. Simon Cowell's understanding of strength also began to change during this period. In his professional life, strength had often been associated with decisiveness, control, and the ability to make clear judgments under pressure. But in the context of fatherhood, strength revealed itself in a very different form. It was present in patience, in repetition, in the willingness to remain steady even when outcomes were uncertain. There were moments that required flexibility rather than authority, listening rather than directing, and observation rather than intervention. These moments did not carry public recognition, yet they formed the foundation of daily life. They shaped a relationship that was not defined by visibility, but by consistency. Over time, adaptation became less about responding to challenges and more about anticipating needs in a quiet, attentive way. This did not mean eliminating difficulty or uncertainty. Instead, it meant creating conditions where both could exist without overwhelming the sense of stability that had been carefully built. What emerged from this ongoing process was a deeper understanding of connection. It was not always loud or expressive. Sometimes it existed in stillness, in shared space without demand, or in small moments of recognition that required no explanation. These moments carried their own significance, even if they were invisible to the outside world. In this way, adaptation became not just a response to circumstance, but a form of love expressed through structure, patience, and quiet persistence. What remains beyond the public eye? Despite occasional public glimpses and rare acknowledgments, the most meaningful parts of Simon Cowell's journey as a father remain entirely outside public view. Fame naturally invites interpretation, and visibility often creates the illusion of understanding. Yet the reality of raising a child, especially one whose experience of the world follows a different rhythm, exists largely beyond that surface. What remains unseen is not defined by secrecy but by intimacy. It exists in the ordinary structure of daily life, in routines that repeat without audience, in conversations that may not use many words, and in shared experiences that do not translate easily into headlines or narratives. These are not moments designed for recognition, they are simply lived. There is also a form of protection that comes with this separation. Keeping certain aspects of life away from public interpretation allows them to exist without distortion. It ensures that experiences are not reshaped by external assumptions or simplified into incomplete narratives. For Simon, this separation became an important part of maintaining emotional balance within the family dynamic. At the same time, what remains private is not isolated from meaning. On the contrary, its significance is often deeper precisely because it is not performed or observed. It does not rely on validation. It exists for its own sake, grounded in presence rather than perception. As years continue to pass, this distinction between public identity and private reality becomes less of a contrast and more of a boundary that supports stability. One world continues to operate under visibility and expectation, while the other is shaped by care, understanding, and continuity. Ultimately, what remains beyond the public eye is where the most enduring parts of the story reside, not in what is seen, but in what is quietly lived every single day, letting go of expectations and finding meaning. One of the most profound aspects of Simon Cowell's journey as a father was the gradual release of expectations. The idea of what fatherhood was supposed to look like slowly gave way to what it actually was. This process involved emotional adjustment and acceptance of uncertainty. Some imagined experiences would not unfold in the way once expected, and that required a different kind of understanding. Yet in letting go of those expectations, something deeper emerged. Connection was not diminished by difference, it was reshaped by it. Love expressed itself in quieter, more attentive ways, a bond beyond words. The relationship between Simon and Eric evolved into something defined not by language, but by presence. Communication extended beyond words into gestures, shared understanding, and emotional recognition. This form of connection required attentiveness and patience. It was built through consistency rather than conversation, through shared experience rather than explanation. In many ways, it represented a different kind of intimacy, one that did not rely on conventional expression to be meaningful. A transformation no stage could capture. Over time, the changes in Simon Cowell became evident in subtle ways, not through dramatic transformation, but through quiet shifts in perspective, behavior, and priorities. The man once known for judgment had become someone defined by understanding. His focus shifted from evaluation to support, from critique to care. This transformation was not sudden, but gradual and deeply personal. It reflected a journey that extended far beyond public perception. Conclusion in the quiet truth of love. In the end, the story was not about fame, criticism, or public identity. It was about the quiet evolution of a man learning to love in a way that could not be measured by external standards. Fatherhood redefined everything he once assumed about success and fulfillment. It replaced certainty with presence and judgment with understanding. What remained was a relationship built not on expectation, but on acceptance. A bond shaped by patience, attention, and unconditional care. In that quiet space, away from applause and attention, the most important truth emerged. Love does not require sameness to be complete.